Hello, everyone. Delighted that you can join us again today for our webinar, our second webinar in our current series on EdTech Leadership in Action. During this series, we're spotlighting transformative leadership in EdTech by sharing proven strategies, failures, forward-thinking innovations that are shaping educational technology globally. So, for our second webinar, we are diving into social emotional learning in different contexts and how EdTech can facilitate program implementation, teacher training, and assessment. First, we have Henry May with us, who is the CEO of Coschool. We'll hear how Coschool is pioneering social emotional learning through innovative digital platforms in Latin America. And with a focus on building 21st century skills, Coschool's blended learning programs are equipping students, teachers, and school leaders with tools to foster empathy, resilience, and agency. So we're delighted to have Henry talk about Coschool. And we also have Natalia Hernandez, who is a researcher at the ICEI. And Natalia will demonstrate how we applied an ecological framework for evaluating the impact of Coschool's approach across different levels of the education ecosystem, which some of you might find useful in applying in your own context. Then we're going to move to Janella Nelson, Director of Education for ChildFund International. And Janella has been leading work with the Ministries of Education in Sierra Leone, Sri Lanka, and the Philippines to develop culturally and contextually relevant CEL frameworks to integrate CEL within foundational learning. So Janella will talk about the process she's used to develop these frameworks with community-based research and how they are developing CEL teacher training. And she will reflect on the use of EdTech to support CEL and teacher training in these contexts. And finally, we would turn our attention to assessment of CEL through EdTech tools. And we're delighted to have Jess Gropen, Senior Research Scientist at CAST, which is the Centre for Applied Special Technology, who's been pioneering the Circle Up framework in the States and are currently developing formative EdTech assessment tools for CEL. So we've got a good lineup of people today. We hope you enjoy our webinar, and please, as always, participate through questions online through the chat. And also at the end of the panel's discussions. So first of all, I'm going to start by asking Henry, what are the main challenges across Latin America for building 21st century schools? So Henry, over to you. What brought you into this area, and what do you see those main challenges as being?
Thanks very much, Nicola. Great to be here. What brought me into my work is a long story, but the very summarized version of the story is that I began my career as a teacher in public school in South London, and one of my best students academically murdered another student when he was 15 years old, and so and the information that I received from my school leaders, from my head teacher, was that the students needed good grades, and that was the only thing that they needed. And then I kind of saw how that was just not true, how they needed to develop other skills such as self-control, self-awareness, empathy, and many more. But I, as a teacher, found I just didn't have those tools or really know about how to develop those skills. And so that was in London. I moved to Colombia a few years later, and ended up setting up an organization here in Colombia called Coschool, which really has been for the last 11, 12 years a kind of laboratory where we've been experimenting and trying to develop different solutions that can take social and emotional learning into schools, break it down, make it real, tangible, meaningful, accessible for different audiences. We focus a lot of our work on working with public schools and working with schools in challenging circumstances.
Mhm.
We've also worked with fee-paying private schools as well, and everything in between. And so yeah, we've been on quite a journey, learning quite a lot of things, and yeah, but just to pull out maybe a few of the challenges that I see when it comes to bringing social and emotional learning into schools in Latin America. Although I think these will be pretty universal. Probably a top one is this idea of prioritization, that still schools, school systems, governments are probably not prioritizing truly this topic. Often it's
Mhm.
seen as an extra, something additional, something you can kind of tick a box with by doing a workshop once a week, or in some cases once a term with, and that's it. And kind of how do we change that? How do we change the mindset of policymakers, educators, school communities to understand that this is always happening in social and emotional learning, is always on, it's always there. And how do we prioritize it through better allocation of resources, through better training for our
Mhm.
teachers, for educators, and so on. Yeah, and other challenges that I would say we've come across is scalability. Social and
Mhm.
emotional learning has an innately human component, and is obviously based around in many of the best interventions is based around true human connection and
Mhm.
humans spending time with each other away from screens and away from gadgets and
Mhm.
devices. How do you therefore create something that could be scalable and high quality, and could reach millions of young people and millions of beneficiaries? That's a challenge. And I'd say as well, probably the lack of evidence in this field, and the lack of use of kind of a culture around using evidence-based practices, I think is also prevalent. These are skills that are notoriously difficult to measure, hard to quantify, and it's still a pretty new science. And I'm looking forward to hearing from Jess later about his work on this. Is how do we measure these skills,
Mhm.
and therefore how do we decide on which programs to use, on which decisions to make based on evidence? I would say that probably is a challenge, and an area where we need to improve. So yeah, there's a few things to kick off in terms of challenges, and happy to share more about what CoSchool are doing.
Thanks, Henry. That's really contextualized the problem well, and I think the things that you pointed to there, the human component and how that aligns with using EdTech is an interesting point of discussion. The prioritization, absolutely right. This, I think one thing we'll see today unfold is that this is actually at every level of the ecosystem. And the lack of evidence is a challenge for researchers, and for organizations wanting to build on an evidence base. So we will bear those in mind as we work through. But I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about CoSchool's approach to using EdTech to support social and emotional learning, promote equity and inclusion across diverse communities in Latin America. So tell us about what you're doing and how you use EdTech to support that.
Yeah, so it might be interesting to share that CoSchool began really as not as an ed tech organization at all.
Mhm.
Everything that we did in the first kind of 3 or 4 years of the organization was in person. So we were running summer camps based on social emotional learning. We were living with communities and running youth programs around leadership and social entrepreneurship, all focused on developing skills like resilience, empathy, and self-awareness. And over time, as we kind of grappled with the question of scale, we thought, right, how can we use technology to try to scale this up, and to kind of share the knowledge that we had gained through doing all this in-person work. So one of our first approaches, and something we do a lot of, is teacher training. So we've created a platform called EduMoción. EduMoción is it's a bit of a cliche to say this, but kind of a Netflix of resources for for teachers and educators on this specific topic of social and emotional learning. And over the years, we've iterated a lot with how we deliver EduMotion, because really, we don't want it to be like Netflix. We don't want it to be something where people just kind of click on and click off
Mhm.
whenever they want. What we've learned is that cohort-based experiences are the most powerful. So we start with a group of teachers on a set date. We have a kickoff event with them, and then we guide them through a process. That typically lasts quite a short period of time. So we've kind of settled on this kind of time frame of about 4 or 5 weeks as being a kind of a sprint that we work with teachers on, where they have a combination of access to micro learning courses on our platform, weekly webinars where teachers come together and share what they're doing, and then ongoing support from a tutor who we call an edu motivador, an edu motivator, who's supporting them all the time through WhatsApp. And so we're kind of creating, yeah, these different kind of types of experiences and comings together, whether it's via WhatsApp, weekly webinars, or the online platform, where teachers are learning new skills that they can put into place in their own lives first. Kind of the important guiding principle of SEL, that
Yeah.
you can't give what you don't already have. So we need
Mhm.
teachers to learn their own learn about their own social emotional skills. And yeah, I would say ideally as well that EduMotion begins, and the best experience that we've had with EduMotion is when it actually begins with an in-person workshop. So we actually have all the
Mhm.
teachers in a room, we have a facilitator, and then we onboard the teachers. Kind of we say, and we're going to be supporting you, but online in a more kind of scalable fashion over the next 4 weeks, or potentially with two different training pathways. So 4 weeks now and 4 weeks later in the year. So that's EduMotion, and I'll also mention Flori, which is our new product, which is, so obviously when we train teachers, the kind of complaint from teachers is after 3 months, 6 months, and 12 months later, they're like, I wish I was still in touch with you, or I'm facing issues now that I'm not sure how to manage, and the problems keep coming up, and the issues and the need uh, for me as a teacher are still there. And so Flori is kind of the teaching and parenting assistant delivering via WhatsApp. So
Mhm.
this is delivered kind of almost in the form of kind of a curriculum where 100% through WhatsApp. So there's no login to a platform. There's no need for having a password or anything. It's all delivered through WhatsApp. Teachers and parents will receive synchronized learning experiences where, for example, grade 5 teachers will be learning about gratitude, and at the same time, parents will receive information about how to implement gratitude strategies in the house. Um, and so it's all delivered via WhatsApp, kind of micro learning, kind of through WhatsApp, with different kind of pathways in WhatsApp. And this is where we haven't done it yet, but we're going to introduce artificial intelligence and kind of use a personalized language model, so that the through WhatsApp we can actually learn about the users and provide them with 24/7 support. So a parent might say, my daughter like won't talk to me, is having a really hard time. What do I do at 3 o'clock in the morning? And we can provide support for that, kind of through a trained model that obviously is trained on the principles
Mhm.
that we believe in, and the research that we use and so on. So yeah, we feel like we have a bit of a mission on our hands to try to persuade
Mhm.
people not to use ChatGPT and other
Mhm.
commercial LLMs for SEL. They're not designed for that. But we do feel like artificial intelligence can be used effectively in this field, and hopefully we'll be pioneering some of that work here in Colombia and Latin America.
Great, Henry. That's really looking at blended learning approaches for both students, teachers, and parents to ensure long-term impact. An interesting approach there. But you really feel that that in-person event at the start for the teachers is really what sparks their interest in this.
Yeah, I think in person, particularly given that we are talking about, the kind of soulcraft and with the work of people, things moving internally and so on, that happens more naturally in contexts where we are in together with people. And
Yeah.
I'd also say that one other insight that we have and kind of a strong belief that we have today is the importance of working with school leadership teams and the importance of school climate and school culture. The work that we did with you and Natalia, looking at Bronfen Burner's ecological system and thinking about systems and culture and so on within a school, I would say often the invisible curriculum, the things that we can't really see or make tangible beyond the pedagogical practices of teachers, the way that the adults treat each other in the school, the way that the leadership communicates with teachers, with families, is really vital. And so we actually have a program called Primed, where we work in a deep, transformative way, doing 3 days in-person work with the leadership teams of schools. And to me, that's kind of like the first domino that needs to fall, because you can go in and you can do teacher training or you can provide resources for the classrooms or for parents. But if the school culture and climate is not truly attuned to this and prioritizing this topic and realizing this is important and therefore and has intentional strategies from school leadership, then the other stuff won't really work.
Yeah.
And that transformation of culture begins kind of with the transformation of the leaders, and that transformation of the leaders kind of like happens, I think, really through doing deep personal work and them kind of learning about themselves, and that is that work is definitely done better in person. And yeah, kind of so also we have a kind of a belief there. If you're going to do the in-person work, I would do it with the leadership team, because that's where you're going to get kind of more return on the investment. That's where you're going to get hopefully changes in school culture and changes where the leaders then are the people who are guiding and navigating their schools through these processes.
Brilliant. Thanks, Henry. And that leads us really nicely on to Natalia Hernandez, who has been conducting some research alongside myself at the centre here. And Natalia, I wondered if you could describe how this co-school approach impacts the different levels of the education ecosystem from a learning scientist perspective.
Thank you, Nikki, for the question. First of all, I want to thank you, Henry, Nicole, that is not here, and also you, Nikki, because together we developed Coschool's evidence-ready report, which included their logic model and their theory of change, and also a literature review connected directly to Coschool's activities. What I will share today reflects those findings. So thank you again. So to the question, from a learning science view, the key is where change starts and how it spreads. Bronfenbrenner gives us the map for this. We are seeing the screen exactly these layers that are nested one in another. So think of development as nested systems that interact over time. Next, please. The first layer is the microsystem. These are the immediate settings. For example, the classroom routines, the teacher-students interactions, peers, and also family. This is exactly where SEL shows up first, with emotion regulation, engagement, and also early academic shifts. Next, please. The next layer is the mesosystem. These are the connections among those settings. School-family communications, professional learning communities, and also leadership touchpoints. Strong connections make classroom practice stick. So that's the key of this layer. The next layer, next please, is the exosystem. The exosystem are indirect structures shaping classrooms. So this includes district professional development models, platforms that are using, leadership training, and also analytics to make decisions. Teachers feel these as time savers or also constraints, of course. The next, please. The next layer is the macro system, which includes policy, culture, and norms. These are, of course, national mandates, alliances, SDG framing, and so on. This layer signals priorities and unlocks resources. Next, please. The kernel system is the last layer, and this is exactly changed over time, which includes cohorts, transitions, and especially how we measure growth. Cell develops. It's not just an on-off switch, so to speak. Next, please. With this, exactly with this lens, here's how Coschool's approach engages each level. I'm going to show you how it blends human facilitation and EdTech so change is feasible and sustained. So next, please. The first one by the microsystem, which includes students and classrooms. Coschool centers teacher-student relationships and intentional modeling. Short and bend routines for emotional check-ins and regulation. The EduMotion platform has learning paths that turn evidence into bite-sized activities. They see gains in reading, math, and science, especially for students with lower starting motivation. The AI-driven tool Flory gives teachers real-time coaching, personalized nudges without extra planning. So in the next layer, the mesosystem, which includes school and family connections, impacts last when teachers work in professional learning communities and get feedback from peers and leaders. In Puerto Rico, a randomized trial showed leadership monitoring significantly increased completion of Coschool online professional development, meaning that small structural tweaks causes big impacts on uptake. Next, please. The next layer is the exosystem, which includes institutional and policy supports. Primate, that Henry already mentioned, is thought for school leaders to equip them to embed cell school-wide. This helped that adoption of cell strategies with the support from the institutional level. The platform EduMotion integrates teacher well-being and reflective practice, aligning with best practice of professional development. And finally, the AI tools, Flory, and they are also developing another one called Emotic, turn classroom signals into actionable data for educators and over time also for parents. Next, please. The macro system, in the macro system, we have here societal and policy levels. Coschool co-founded AFSEC, which is Colombia's first national cell alliance, translating school innovation into policy guidance. Their work supports Colombia's new cell mandate. We have here in Colombia 2 laws that are already ongoing and advances SDGs on quality education and well-being. It's important that policy normalizes cell beyond individual schools. Finally, the kernel system, which is the change over time, Coschool's trajectory moves toward game-based and adaptive cell assessment with Emotic, a continuous culturally relevant measurement and longitudinal tracking. Schools don't just need a snapshot, they need more a growth curve to iterate practice. So next, please. Putting it simple, we can see that like human facilitation, which includes relationships, routines, professional learning communities, and also leadership, plus technology, which includes, of course, platforms, AI coaching, and assessment, equals change that starts in classrooms. If you see that from the layers of Promenfrenner, change that starts in classrooms is reinforced through connections, resourced by systems, legitimized by policy, and sustained over time. So that's exactly the idea. If you want to have one takeaway, design for multiple levels and multiple timescales. That's how CEL moves from promising pilots to system-wide improvement. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalia. That was really well put and really well explained. And I think what applying these kind of ecosystem frameworks do is it gives you a structured approach to understanding a program, but also researching that program. So having this sort of structured framework where you're looking very, very closely at these layers and how these different layers interact with each other enables you to understand your program much better, identify the evidence gaps, and to deliver targeted research to provide an evidence base for that. So that was really helpful. Thank you, Natalia. And we are going to see this systems approach again by our next speaker, Janella Nelson, who has been applying a very similar approach to her work in low and middle income countries. So can we have Janella up on screen? So, Janella, lovely for you to join us. And I'd like you to talk a little bit about your work at ChildFund International and particularly focus on what have been the biggest challenges with embedding social and emotional learning within foundational literacy and numeracy programs in the LNMCs, and how you think having a national cell framework will help address these barriers. If you could take us through your work, that would be great.
Yeah, I'll first start just to give some background on some of the work that we've been doing at Child Fund. So we've been working for over 8 years with the Ministry of Education in about 7 countries on social emotional learning. We've worked in social emotional learning with ministries before that, but really specifically on teacher training in social emotional learning and integration and foundational learning. So we have collected data over the past, I'd say 6 years now, on over 12,000 students, teachers, and caregivers on social emotional learning within a program that is called the Education for Protection and Wellbeing program. And in that program, what we realized was that, well, first, in many of these countries, there are so many different social emotional learning frameworks that are used. So in one country, you could see maybe 4 frameworks that were being used. So teachers in one region are expected to apply social emotional learning that looks like this. And then another region, it would look a little different, even though it was within the same country and possibly the cultural context wasn't so different. So what we realized is we really needed to work in a different way. And we were part of the problem as an organization coming in with a framework that was a Western framework. And so then we decided, okay, how can we work with the ministries of education who have already committed to integrating social emotional learning into foundational learning? And so specifically, I'm going to talk about this specific program that we have, which is called the SALES program, which is Social Emotional Learning at Scale, which is in Sri Lanka, Sierra Leone, and the Philippines. But I'll also talk a little bit about the work that we've done in India and social emotional learning. So I would say that these 3 countries and India are the countries where we really have worked at a much more institutional level. And so with this project, the SALES project, is to provide technical guidance to the ministry to first conduct community-based research on social emotional learning. So what is social emotional learning in Sierra Leone, in Sri Lanka? And then to co-create a national framework tailored to the needs of that country, culture, and what is relevant. And then from there, work on a teacher training package and then generate local evidence to look at what kind of teacher training. And we are still hoping to have a dual modality, so like a hybrid training. And what does that really look like in these teacher contexts? Could you go to the next slide, please? And so this has been the process. We have looked at what are the mechanisms in the countries that are already working on social emotional learning, and how can what already is done within the curriculum, for example. In these countries, social emotional learning is integrated, but it's not explicitly taught or teachers are trained on it. And then we conducted community-based research. We did a desk review, literature review. We had inputs from multiple experts, not only from the Ministry of Education, but experts who work also for other ministries within the government and academics. And then from there, we have been working with these countries to develop a social emotional learning framework based on this input and this community-based research. Next. And so we've had technical committees in all of these countries that have been composed of all of these different experts and on social emotional learning and education or child well-being, social welfare and gender, for example. And we've collected data from the communities, and that has fed into the development of these frameworks. Next. So here's the example of the social emotional learning framework from Sri Lanka. We also have it from the Philippines as well. And in Sierra Leone right now, we're at this point where we're just trying to finalize the framework and identify what are those key skills. It's very challenging when you have so much data and for everyone to come into what are those skills, the key skills. Next. And so we have been already leveraging EdTech to teach social emotional learning. In Philippines, we have a framework that ensures that our programs are aligned with the Ministry of Education's ICT assisted teaching. And so in the Philippines, the project that is focused on social emotional learning at scale is called the Excellent Project. And so we have this teacher training package, which has 3 foundational courses in it. And so part of those courses are going to be uploaded on the learning management system that is for teachers that is within the Ministry of Education. But part of it will be in person because we think there really needs to be both. And so part of the challenge, though, is that how much really does need to be in like a digital format, and what does that digital format look like? So for example, in Sierra Leone, when we tried to do this, we had teacher training on social emotional learning, a hybrid training. And in the end, what happened was all the teachers decided that they would actually prefer to come together in one room to do the hybrid training, to do the online training instead of having to do it separately. And so there is, I think, a lot to be said what we don't see or what we can't measure, and that kind of social support, social cohesion that happens in these trainings, in these workshops. In addition to the challenges that we see are this digital divide, that we have bandwidth in some countries. So I'll go to the next slide, please. So in India, for example, it's pretty inexpensive bandwidth, but there's still a very big digital divide. And so access to technology, and who has access to that technology in terms of, the children that we really need to reach, do they have access? So while we have done a lot of these different activity, or we've used EdTech to leverage to teach SEL. So we have had interactive e-learning SEL resources. We've integrated them into otherwise a public, like a Ministry of Education platform, or possibly a private platform. We've developed animated videos. And there's in India specifically, and I think my colleague might be even on here that could share more a little bit later. They've developed animated videos on SEL competencies and films in Hindi to try to support discussion on social emotional learning skills and integrate it. And then there's a PAL application, iPrep, that they've been using to integrate social emotional learning into foundational literacy and numeracy. And what I think is really important is that it's online and offline. I think that is really important for us to consider when we are thinking about designing different tools. And so the challenge has been that, teachers do not have the confidence to use some of these. And so they might use it for a short time, but they feel like it's an add-on. And Henry kind of mentioned this, that it's not necessarily integrated completely in the way that they teach, their approach of teaching. And sometimes they're overwhelmed by all the content that comes to them. There are so many different platforms that are now available that teach social emotional learning, or that might teach numeracy or literacy. And so which are the ones that are of quality? And how can we ensure that they're culturally relevant when some of these are designed in other countries? And then there hasn't been such an investment into teachers' skills, digital skills. And so that is a real challenge, that teachers do not feel confident in using technology always.
Very interesting, Janella, and yeah, the investment into teachers' digital skills is a real challenge. And you know, we assume that teachers have these skills and can pick them up. And to actually deliver quality education, you need the support. You need the teachers to be able to use these tools confidently, because if you're faced with a class of learners, you want to be sure of what you're doing. So, a very interesting point to make. I just wondered, with the last minute, Janella, if you could just give us some thoughts as to how you think these kind of technologies can maintain a sort of sustained interest by teachers. It's something I was going to ask Henry also. So Henry talked about the need for an in-person event to sort of get teachers onto, you know, onboarding teachers onto the program. But I'm just wondering if you know of any ways, or you've thought through sort of any ways that EdTech might be used to keep teachers on board and keep teachers interested.
Yeah, I mean, I think one example is in Sierra Leone that we have. So in Sierra Leone, we found that secondary school teachers are much more interested in technology because they're younger. So interestingly, it seems that a lot of the teachers that are in secondary school, they're younger teachers, and they have been really interested. And so we were able to get tablets and introduce technology within this program. And we found that the teachers from the secondary school we are having them be like coaches or mentors when it comes to the digital work. And so I think that's an example of who are the teachers that are most willing to take it up. And how can they then support other teachers to make it more sustainable? And then one of the questions you had asked about, you know, how does these frameworks that are culturally relevant ensure sustainability, and how EdTech can support that? The truth is that these social emotional learning frameworks, they should be already somewhat embedded into the curriculum. So when we did a mapping, we saw, okay, well, there's nothing on paper that says that this is a social emotional learning framework for the Philippines. But when you look at the curriculum, well, obviously this is already in the curriculum. So now having this framework and having teacher training tools and leveraging technology that's aligned to that framework is really going to help move forward the use of EdTech in social emotional learning, because otherwise there are so many different frameworks and there could be so many different tools. And so now the Philippines can say, this is our framework. And so if you're going to develop a tool, it needs to align to this framework.
With that framework, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Thanks, Janella. That's great. And I think those frameworks might also help prioritize cell programs within different countries, which is, you know, one of the challenges that Henry identified at the beginning. Thank you. Now, I noticed on your second slide that you had the components of cell down, and assessment was one of the key components. And this is something that we've struggled with our own research, is finding good assessment tools at different levels of children's ability. So I'm going to invite Jess now, Jess Gropen from CAST, to tell us about their Circle Up framework and how teachers can use it in classrooms to support students' social emotional learning. And Jess, I know you've got some slides, but we're going to be looking at the design of formative EdTech tools to capture social emotional learning, as well as looking at considerations for the most critical considerations to ensure that EdTech based cell assessments are equitable, inclusive and adaptive across diverse educational contexts. So, Jess, thanks so much for joining us today. We'll upload your slides now and let you take us through those.
Wonderful. Thank you, Nicola. And, welcome, everyone. Um, so, first question that I'd like to address is telling you about the Circle Up framework and how teachers can use it in their classrooms to support students' social and emotional learning. And the next slide gives you a little bit of information about the Circle Up framework. What I should say at the outset is that Circle Up is an early phase education and innovation research project funded by the U.S. Department of Education. We are about halfway through this work, so it's a big development effort, and we're in one district in Texas doing this work. Throughout this, my remarks, some of my colleagues are going to be putting links in the chat for helpful resources. So the Circle Up framework is a few key things to know about it. First, it is integrated with academic content, a point that was just made by Janella. It is so important. It's not a standalone program. But let me also emphasize that it is not solving all of the issues, right? It doesn't really focus on climate and culture. It is not direct instruction around SEL strategies. It's actually embedded in the curriculum. So it is really meant to be used in combination with all of these wonderful pieces, for instance, co-design, Coschool, and whatnot. So secondly, it is goal-oriented. By that, I mean it refers to the thoughts, feelings, and actions that arise during learning activities as students grapple with reaching their learning goals. So it's really getting to the sort of nitty-gritty of the kind of the emotions that arise, the thoughts that arise as kids are trying to learn reach their learning goals. So it's quite focused. You can think of it as really zooming in on the microsystem. If you're thinking of the sort of ecological approach, it is a teacher training program, but this framework itself is focused on that level. So that we think is really critical because many times teachers will send kids in the States to the office when the root of the problem is something to do with the learning. So we want to address it right in the classroom. Finally, it's discipline agnostic. It can be applied to any subject matter. It's really based on a relatively small set of psychological universals. It's discipline agnostic. Um, but I want to also say that I found the approach of co-designing a framework to be really interesting. This is kind of the other end of the spectrum in some sense. What I would say is that we think of this as starting point, which needs to be adapted to a local context. It's so critical that it be adapted and that it be sort of integrated with some of the cultural variability that you find in every culture. So I would think of it like that. We can discuss pros and cons maybe in the Q&A. The next slide gets into what is the basis of this framework. It's really based on three different person-oriented learning patterns or themes. First, resilient learning, helping students see challenges as opportunities for growth. So that's all around competency beliefs such as growth mindset, goal orientation, self-efficacy. And here we want teachers to design classrooms that help students take risks. Meaningful learning is kind of the flip side. So whereas resilient learning is more about perhaps avoidance as a psychological universal, meaningful learning is about approach. And this is really based on the latest findings in cognitive affective neuroscience. How can we help children ignite their passion for learning? So here it's based on values, their interests, relevance, goal ownership. We want teachers to be able to design classrooms that give kids opportunities to engage in learning that is meaningful, that is truly meaningful. So critical and so often
Mm.
Finally, strategic learning, helping students be strategic in reaching their learning goals. Here, it's about basic goal motivation. What are the goals that kids are trying to reach? Do they understand the goals? What strategies are they using to reach those goals? Did they reach the goals? What are the outcomes? So here, we want teachers to focus on that kind of strategic thinking and actually help kids think in the language of strategies rather than, let's say, blaming themselves if they've failed in a particular assignment. So, so the main thing is about this. How do we support teachers? Well, we support them by helping them become more sensitive to the underlying learning patterns and how these patterns influence how students appraise situations and the emotions that arise. Because ultimately, we want the teachers to be able to help kids um, uh, adopt adaptive competency beliefs and values and strategies that will serve them in the long run. The next slide, I think, is introducing a second question. How does the Circle Up framework inform the design of formative EdTech tools that authentically capture students' social emotional learning? So the next slide digs into this a little bit. And basically, we have created a suite of tools. And this is where I will say co-design comes into our project. Because while we didn't use co-design to create the framework, we used the framework to constrain the co-design of tools and strategies with our education partners. So we had a full year of co-design, then another year of piloting and refinement. We created tools that basically assess the concepts in the Circle Up framework, as well as the barriers that students are facing and their emotions. So it ties directly into the framework.
Mhm.
The strategies themselves are targeted to help students overcome the barriers. And something got blipped out here, but I think what that was I'm going to say is it's a way to fundamentally change the way change how students engage in learning. That's what it's really about. It's a very different process, right? It's not
Mm.
that the social emotional stuff is implicit. It's right there. And
Mm.
let me show you by um, showing you two quick tools, and we can share other resources. So the next slide gives you an example of a tool called the Goal Meter. And if you look at this, what it does is it highlights the goal, but it then has students rate their confidence in being able to reach the goal. So this is basically a self-efficacy judgment.
Mm.
We also ask kids to indicate how they're feeling, why they're feeling that way, and the biggest barrier that they're facing. So it's really designed to get at some of these competency related beliefs. The next slide shows the other end of the learning experience. So the goal meter is used early on in a learning experience. The reflection tool is used towards the end. And here we're looking at whether kids think they've reached the goal. So again, part of that strategic thinking, what emotion they're feeling, why they're feeling that way, and also the strategy they used and their rating of the strategy. And that rating actually is something that we want to build an adaptive EdTech solution around, a little bit of supervised learning there.
Mhm.
So what we're getting at here in reflection is causal attribution. So if they haven't succeeded, to what do they attribute their failure? So critical. We want to understand what their mindset is, their goal orientation. These are all things that can be generated by this tool and some of the other resources. So a final question is what considerations are most critical to ensure that ed tech-based style assessments are equitable, inclusive, and adaptable across diverse contexts. So here I would simply say the Universal Design for Learning, or UDL framework that CAST has pioneered, is really a great way to start because it is a practitioner framework that explicitly addresses accessibility, equity, diversity, and inclusion. So it's a framework to minimize barriers, providing options and strategies, and developing learner agency. Let me also say that CAST has some very specific information around accessibility and EdTech tools. We can add the link for that. Recently, we've been doing a lot of work around AI and UDL. So there's information there. We also have an AI and UDL learning community that we invite people to join so we can provide that information. So there's a lot of work that we're doing in this direction. A final thing that I want to say, though, is about just assessment in general. So these are formative assessments. How do they under, help us understand impact? And I would say you want to take an approach, hopefully, I think, around evidence-centered design, where you're building a chain of evidence or an evidentiary argument. So we're starting with formative assessment right in the moment, right? We're understanding how kids are feeling, what they're thinking. We're getting a direct pulse on some of the critical SEL aspects, the interpersonal ones that are affecting their learning. From there, we go to whatever proximal outcome might be relevant, such as their grade on an assignment or their grade on a test. From there, we can go to more distal outcome measures, such as, end of unit exams. I think that's the best way to understand what's going on. Now, in this project, we use Panorama assessment because that's what the district administers. Panorama assesses SEL using self-report measures a couple of times a year. Honestly, it has its limitations. We all know that self-report is going to have its limitations. So I would say, just like any research enterprise, you want to triangulate and use multiple sources of evidence. And I say, get to the heart of it, get to that, what's going on in the moment, and then branch out from there to really see what's going on. I agree completely that this is a developmental process. It takes time. You want to understand that. And hopefully you're not starting in fourth and fifth grade like we are, though it's a good place to start for our considerations. You really want to start, from birth. That's what it's about. So
Thanks
I
so
think that's
much.
it. Thank
Thanks,
you.
Jess. That's great. And it struck me that your goal meter and reflection tool themselves could be used for impact evaluation. If you monitored, especially over time, you could do a really nice time sequence analysis, looking at how learners report on those tools change over a period of time. So interesting tools that are already in place for research and evidence gathering.
Yeah.
So thank you everybody for your contributions today. We have 8 minutes left for questions from the audience. If anybody would like to ask a question, put your hand up or post in the chat. I hope you found the webinar interesting today. Certainly, the focus on co-design, the focus on, human contact and in-person contact, and EdTech facilitating scaling and prioritization, I think is something that came through. Any questions anyone would like to ask? So we've of and definitions of these cell constructs. So how do these cell constructs sort of differ across different cultures? Can we generalize at all? Who would like to have a go at that? Janella?
I'll go then, Jess. Yeah, thanks. So it is very true that there is multiple definitions to SEL constructs. And this is, I think, one of the most fascinating aspects of this kind of work. I'll say that Harvard EASL Lab has done a lot of research on the different frameworks that have been used in low and middle income countries and looking at the different definitions of SEL constructs. So I think that's a very great resource to use. I can put it in the chat afterwards. But I think that's very true. And I'll give an example. So in Philippines, one of the constructs that came out that seems to be very relevant and they put in the framework is industry. Mm-hmm. Now, what does industry, that word, or, we really had to do a lot of explaining because I have a global working group that we work with my colleagues on social emotional learning. But they realized that, okay, well, this word, it's very, very different, but we have something that is similar. So now that the other country might not think that was the most important skills. But for Philippines, that was one of the most important skills. And so it is true that culture does influence, really the value that we put on these different skills, and then what those skills really look like in that culture. And Jess.
Yeah, I think the only thing I'll add is that there is cultural variability. So one of the things that we talk a lot about in our framework is growth mindset and, how important that is. That may be true in a lot of Western cultures, but in more collectivist cultures like East Asian countries, it's a little bit different. So there's research out by Sun et al., I think 2021, that shows that, let's say, Chinese students can have a fixed mindset, but still be very motivated to perform well in school. So so there are different dynamics at play here, and we probably don't have time to go into it. What I would say is definitely the EASL Lab is a wonderful resource, but then I think you need to look at the very specific research in a culture to understand how these things play out. And I also have to say, a lot of this research is in its infancy. So it's one of these things that will take time to really understand. So it's systematic, but it may differ. I will say that.
So that poses a challenge for research, especially when you're trying to draw inferences and conclusions across different countries. And we've just had another question post, if we can address it quickly. Is it possible to evaluate social and emotional skills among children globally using standard indicators, similar to how literacy and numeracy levels are addressed? Ultimately, if we're going to make cross-country comparisons, we're going to need tools that do span different cultures while still capturing those cultural nuances. Any thoughts on that, anyone?
Yeah, my thought is so we've been doing that at ChildFund. That's where I said we have 12,000. We've collected data from 12,000 children, caregivers, educators, in 8 different countries. And so we're looking across the different countries and the skills. I think the challenge here is that now we have these frameworks that are the frameworks in these countries. And so we have to work with the ministry to develop measures. Now there's some skills that across, and I would say this is one of my most interesting, I think I'm most interested in this in the research of what are the skills that are resonating across every culture. Emotional regulation. And that's one of them, right? In every single country we work in, that seems to come out. And so are there tools that can be used? As Jess was saying, a lot of the research is still in its infancy. And so we don't have as much research from low and middle income countries. And in fact, the literature review we did came up with very little information that was academically published on social emotional learning. And at least in Sierra Leone and Sri Lanka, it's the first data that they have on social emotional learning. So there's definitely challenges. Mm-hmm.
My hope is that we can come up with a way of
Mm,
making these comparisons, even if some parameters are going to differ from culture to culture. And the same, I would say, is true of understanding emotion. So, Ricard Pekron has done great work on achievement emotions and some cross-linguistic work. And there's a lot of comparability across cultures, but some differences.
mm.
So again, I think you have to be will
Balance.
see it both sides.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone. There are more questions coming into the chat, but we are out of time. I've really enjoyed the webinar today. I hope you have too. I hope you found it informative. As always, if you would like to continue this conversation, please feel free to reach out to the centre. You can send emails to me, and I will facilitate the ongoing discussion. I think for the last point, we probably need some sort of global repository of data where we can analyze cell assessment across cultures to be able to really pull out those generics that we were talking about and those country-specific factors. Thank you to all our speakers. We are back in November with two of our leadership webinars, one focused on EdTech for facilitating agriculture, mostly in Africa, where we joined with Access Agriculture and UVU Africa. And then we have a second webinar in November on structures and EdTech, how it impacts different levels of the education structure, looking at work with ministries and different levels, and that's with the Global Schools Forum. So please follow our links on LinkedIn and our website if you're interested in joining those webinars. We would be delighted to welcome you back. I hope you've enjoyed today and enjoy the rest of your day and evening. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.